Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure. I just want to thank the minister for her initial comments. Certainly, I can't think of very many people who speak more eloquently in support of our province and our resource industries than her, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to have there's other members that are going to speak today on this motion, but I'm going to focus my comments, Mr. Speaker, on the last part of today's motion, where it talks about the interests of Western Canada and the fact that we essentially have a Liberal NDP coalition government that actively works against those interests, Mr. Speaker, and more specifically here in this House, they work against the interests of Saskatchewan. Now, in Saskatchewan and in Western Canada in general, we want to work hard with what we have, Mr. Speaker. We want to create a better life for our families and our communities. And, Mr. Speaker, working hard that's no problem for this province, Mr. Speaker. I see it every day in the people of my constituency and the people of this province, Mr. Speaker. And when we talk about working hard with what we have, Mr. Speaker, what we have is the land. We are so incredibly blessed with a geology and a geography that positions us so well, Mr. Speaker. And that geology and geography means that we can not only feed and power ourselves, but we can also help other parts of the world, other parts of our country, feed themselves and power themselves. Mr. Speaker, it's well known, on this side of the House at least, that it seems regardless of how hard Saskatchewan people work and how hard we push as a provincial government to represent the interests of this province, we just seem to have a federal government that stands in the way of our province and stands in the way of Western Canada succeeding. It seems to be some form of self-inflicted cruelty, Mr. Speaker. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to just focus in for a moment here on one policy in particular of the federal government right now, Mr. Speaker, that of this Trudeau-NDP coalition that is just flying directly in the face of Western Canadian interests, of Saskatchewan interests. And, Mr. Speaker, those are the current travel restrictions in this country. And I just want to remind members here today that the federal government has still mandated that in order to board a plane in Canada or depart from a Canadian airport, an individual still must show proof of vaccination to the airline that they're flying with. And there's also, as we many of us have probably received calls from constituents as they've tried to navigate these different rules. There's still similar restrictions for people entering the country, Mr. Speaker. And the result of these policies, Mr. Speaker, it's playing out in airports across Canada. And I'm sure many of us have seen kind of the nightmare that's happening at Pearson Airport, Toronto, with extremely long wait times. And I think specifically, Mr. Speaker, we went almost 20-some months in this province not being allowed to receive international flights at either of our two major airports. And that had significant implications, Mr. Speaker, for our province. And that was solely based on a decision by this federal government, a federal government, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP have propped up. Airport organizations, Canadian Airlines, they're rightly upset with this policy, Mr. Speaker. And they're themselves pushing the federal government to drop the rules. Mr. Speaker, these rules are out of touch and they're out of line with what's happening elsewhere in the world, Mr. Speaker. As I said, self-inflicted cruelty before, it's happening in this specific policy, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, sometimes there's a temptation to think of travel as purely a leisure activity. And, for many people in the province it is. It's a great opportunity to escape the winter, Mr. Speaker, and go to a sunnier destination. But Mr. Speaker, the constituents that I've spoken with, that I've heard from, that I know many of my colleagues have heard from in their constituency, Mr. Speaker, many of them just want to go see their families. Many of them want to reconnect with family members they haven't been able to see in the last couple of years. They want to be able to celebrate a wedding or a marriage of children or nieces or nephews, grandchildren. I think, Mr. Speaker, of the many families that have had to delay funerals or memorial services over the last couple of years. And those are important things to be at, Mr. Speaker, for family members. And so, again, travel is not just about escaping to a sunnier destination. For many people, it's about seeing their loved ones, being able to celebrate important life moments with their loved ones. That's a critically important part of life, Mr. Speaker. Don't know how better to put that. And Mr. Speaker, I also think of the people that wish to come to Canada as tourists. to come to Saskatchewan as tourists, Mr. Speaker, who are going to come here and spend money and stimulate our economy. And I think particularly of the outfitting industry, Mr. Speaker. That's an industry that's a significant industry in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, and in the northwest of this province. And that industry depends so much on both domestic and international visitors to our province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also think about the $14 billion of private sector investment that this province and this government have attracted over the last year. And it's been well canvassed in this House, Mr. Speaker. You know, Cargill investing in a new canola crush facility, Richardson making investments in this province, Mr. Speaker, and of course BHP building Saskatchewan's newest potash mine at their Jansen site. You know, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't take a lot of research to find out a few things. Cargill's head office is in Minnesota. BHP has major offices all around the world, Australia, London, etc. Richardson's office is in Winnipeg, Mr. Speaker. And those companies that have made significant investments into this province, Mr. Speaker, they're going to need to send people to this province. Some permanent, some temporary, as they scale up these sites, Mr. Speaker. And we need to ensure that those investments are successful, Mr. Speaker. And again, this is where this federal policy, Mr. Speaker, of the travel restrictions is going to significantly affect how these companies may be able to scale up their operations. And, you know, I think of the many sectors in this province, Mr. Speaker, the business owners that I speak with in the Battlefords and that I hear from, you know, in Regina when I'm here in the city, Mr. Speaker, there's a significant need for labour capacity in this province, as there is elsewhere in Canada, Mr. Speaker. And so hundreds, if not thousands of people are going to need to come to our province, Mr. Speaker. And I worry, Mr. Speaker, that this federal policy is going to affect that. So, Mr. Speaker, it's time for the federal government to drop the remaining travel restrictions. It's time for the federal government to allow the free flow of individuals, both domestically and internationally, so that families can see each other, so that people can visit our beautiful province, and so that our Saskatchewan economy can reach its full potential. That's in the interest of Western Canada. That's in the interest of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. And I can confidently say, Mr. Speaker, to the people of my constituency of this province that this government is standing up for the people of Saskatchewan. We're working hard to attract new investment into the province. I've spoken briefly about that. We're improving government services where necessary, Mr. Speaker. And we're pushing back on this federal government's, this federal Liberal NDP coalition's punitive policies that are having negative effects on Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I know that members all across this side of the House regularly speak with members of Parliament to advance our province's interest. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to see the same from the members opposite. They have a golden opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to speak with the people who belong to the same party as they do. And yes, that is true, Mr. Speaker. It's in their provincial NDP constitution. Let's not forget that those members opposite hold the same membership card as Jagmeet Singh. It's right there in the Constitution. They have an opportunity to speak with those NDP members who are propping up Justin Trudeau about the policies that are hurting this province. Will they, Mr. Speaker? That's my question. Mr. Speaker, the member for Regina Rosemont has spoken before in this House about his travels up the Churchill River. Perhaps when he paddles up the Churchill River this summer, he'll hop out of his canoe, speak to the NDP MP from Northern Manitoba, speak to her about how these federal Liberal NDP policies are hurting the people of this province. I hope he does, Mr. Speaker. You know, perhaps more importantly, Mr. Speaker, I hope the member for Regina Lakeview will speak up. She looks like she's likely to become the new opposition leader in just over a month's time. But, Mr. Speaker, it looks like her NDP will follow the same old NDP plan. Avoid making any criticism of the mothership federal NDP, even if it comes at the expense of Saskatchewan jobs and communities, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let there be no question where members on this side of the House stand when it comes to opposing the carbon tax, respecting responsible gun ownership, promoting the energy sector, and standing up for the interests of Saskatchewan. I will be supporting this government motion, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.